That was a terrific first panel. And this being our first collaboration in Washington with Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute, I can foresee a lot of cooperation down the road because Wendy and her team have been terrific to work with. And we look forward to continuing that relationship. What an outstanding panel. This panel, as was indicated, is going to be more on the industry side, more on the private sector side. And so we hope to fill in some of the gaps that may have been discussed in the first panel. Certainly, that panel put forward a very high standard, but I'm confident that our panelists can meet it. Before we do a quick introduction and launch into the actual substance, two quick things. One is if you care to live tweet this event, we would be pleased if you would. We don't actually have a hashtag for it, but if you hashtag NAFTA, North America, Canada, Mexico, etc., it will probably go to the intended audience, so feel free to do that. And the second is that this event is being recorded, so anything you say can and will be used against you. But indeed, for those who may look for a copy of it, we will have that available early next week, so feel free to hunt that down as well. My name is Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington Office of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society. And I also run our trade activities. And as you might imagine, from the Council of America's perspective, NAFTA is really in our strike zone. It's in our DNA. It's something that we've been promoting since even before the agreement, and we remain strong supporters of the effort. But clearly, times are changing, and was indicated in the first panel. The Canadian Prime Minister was just in Washington discussing these issues. We see from news reports that the U.S. Secretary of State and the Secretary of Homeland Security will be in Mexico City on February 23rd. These discussions are active and they're live and they're happening in real time. And so it's our hope that we'll be able to contribute to those discussions today. But you know, we hear a lot about the need to renegotiate NAFTA. We hear a lot about some of the ideas out there, but we don't hear a lot about the economic and commercial ties that bind our countries, and we aren't sure that some of these issues are really well understood by the broader public, certainly in the United States. And so those are some of the issues we want to explore today. Really, how is business done in North America? What does NAFTA mean to business? And to the extent NAFTA can be improved and may be improved, what would that mean? And who would some of the winners and some of the losers be in that process? And so we're delighted to have attracted such a strong program of panelists here this morning. And again, you have their biographic information that was made available, so I'll skip the extended bios, but suffice it to say that Amgad and Audrae and Veso are first rate, and I believe we're all in for a treat. Amgad, of course, is Senior Vice President of the UPS Corporation. Audrae Erickson is the Vice President of Mead Johnson Nutrition, and she's also doing some work in a broader agriculture coalition as a co-leader of that, so we're going to hear from her about the agriculture sector today. And Veso Sobot is the Director of Corporate Affairs with the IPEX Group, and we're going to hear a lot about that from the manufacturing sector. So if you would please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists to the panel today. Well, we're going to start with Amgad, who, as I mentioned, is with the UPS Corporation. Amgad, you know, we hear a lot about supply chains. People throw that term around, supply chains, and you know, it seems, I mean, you can get a degree in supply chain management in college these days. When I was, you know, helping to negotiate NAFTA at a very junior level, supply chains really weren't a thing. They didn't exist. What are supply chains? And from your perspective, what does it mean in the North American context? How is business done today?
Eric, and thanks for having me. Maybe one of the problems is you should have gone to college for supply chains. We would have had better NAFTA.
I wouldn't be here.
So, you know, it didn't come up in the previous panel, but I'd tell you that Canada always talks about, and Mexico talks about, 40% of the goods coming in from Mexico have U.S. origin content. 20% of the goods from Canada have U.S. content. So in a short answer, that's supply chains. And that's what we've built in North America, a North American manufacturing platform that includes those supply chains.
And how has NAFTA actually built those? Because again, this has been something that's evolved over the last almost 25 years to the point where in the previous panel we were talking about if you break up NAFTA, this is, you know, we're so integrated, this is what it actually means. But how has NAFTA facilitated that?
Rules of origin. You heard it before. Supply chains and rules of origin are at the core of that platform.
Very good. We're going to hear from you a little bit later in terms of the nature of your business moving products back and forth and how that matters in the North American context. But let's jump to Audrae. When we talk about trade, the trade community is very good about conceptualizing this in the context of manufacturing and sometimes services. But we don't often talk about agriculture, right? And agriculture is massive in the trade context. We heard a little bit about it in the previous panel. We're going to hear a lot more about it now, aren't we, Audrae? Give us a sense from your perspective. NAFTA in North America broadly is critical to the U.S. agriculture sector, no? Tell us why.
That's absolutely true. NAFTA has been far and away the best agreement that the U.S. food and agricultural sector has ever had. And so far, looking out on the horizon, that's likely to continue for some time. NAFTA reduced tariffs significantly, obviously down to zero, and dealt with some very intractable issues like import licensing. And what that really resulted in was greater efficiencies to move raw materials north and south of the U.S. border into Mexico, into Canada. And so we see a highly integrated U.S. agricultural food and export market for our sector broadly. Today, it could be something so simple as cattle coming in from Canada and Mexico into the U.S. to be processed and packed here in the United States and then exported abroad. It could be processed food sector companies that have plants in all three countries and move materials around. And so we don't really measure the world in terms of are our imports higher or our exports higher when it comes to Canada or Mexico. It's really about the efficiencies that have been generated by NAFTA. Today, since the agreement began, our sector has quadrupled its trade. NAFTA has been pivotal in ensuring that the U.S. agricultural sector has always had a trade surplus globally. And without NAFTA, that would not be possible. And then just one last thing, when you think about it, over $100 million in trade flows even just between our U.S.-Mexico border daily. So it's in two-way trade. It's an extremely important agreement to the food and agricultural sector.
And how has this developed your competitiveness, the agriculture sector competitiveness from a global perspective? I mean, we export platforms to the world, not just North America.
That's exactly right. It's really the integration of our three markets that has enabled the sector in each of these markets to become an export platform to the rest of the world. Certainly that's true for our company, where we enjoy a leading position in all three of the markets and have, for example, a facility in Mexico that serves the entire Western Hemisphere, but we're not unique. That's true for many in the sector. And from commodities to processed foods, we've all benefited tremendously from the ability to further integrate our markets, experience greater efficiencies. But I would submit that most importantly, consumers have benefited the most. Many people look at discussing trade today in terms of workers. That's very important. I think throughout the food and agricultural value chain, Mexico and Canada are integral to the jobs in our sector, but I would submit that it's consumers that have benefited the most. And here in America, we walk into grocery stores and the plethora of choices at highly affordable prices, whether it's fruits and vegetables year-round, is largely due to the NAFTA.
Those of you who celebrated the Super Bowl with guacamole know exactly what she's talking about, as I did. Ves, to you, from the manufacturing sector, first of all, tell us a little bit about what IPEX is. Give us a sense of that. And then let me turn the focus a little bit. We've talked about what NAFTA has meant. Let me ask it a different way. From the manufacturing sector, what would it mean if NAFTA went away? I mean, Wendy provided some scenarios at the end in terms of possibilities. We can't predict the future. But if the relationship was fundamentally changed in some way that reduced some of the benefits, what would that mean for cross-border manufacturing and job creation?
Absolutely. First off, IPEX is a manufacturer of plastic pipe for the construction market. Infrastructure is what we're focused on. We were founded in 1949 in Toronto, Ontario. Our founders escaped from Estonia, ran from the Russians, got to Toronto, started making hula hoops at night and selling them during the day. And within the first 3 years, they made their first million. And they said, Canada, what a country. But they realized that it was a fad and that they better diversify. So they straightened out the hula hoop, and that's how we got into the pipe business. Very quickly, Evald Torkvey, our founder, recognized that Canada is a wonderful market, great market, but in order for us to really be competitive and to play the game as efficiently as possible, we certainly had to look to the U.S. market and to export. And really, that has been one of the reasons why we've had so much success over the 67 years. Canada is only 35 million people. America is 10 times that size. And together, that gives us the scale to be able to compete globally, essentially. We just hosted former Congresswoman Candace Miller at our Michigan plant, where she came in and saw some product that was shipped from Toronto, reworked in Chesterfield, Michigan, and it was shipped to the Middle East. Those kind of supply chains have developed over the last 65, 66, 67 years for us. And they're absolutely integral now in everything we do. You mentioned what would happen if NAFTA was ripped up. Well, Canada, it's interesting. Canada's in a unique position. Everything reverts back to the FTA. Now, there are some benefits within NAFTA that we would lose if NAFTA was ripped up. And I think if NAFTA was ripped up too, I think it would be a detriment to America, because there are some clauses in the NAFTA that gives America actually cheaper access to oil. Now, I just want to sort of push back to the energy sector for a second. All our products depend very heavily on natural gas. A lot of it comes from Canada, shipped down to the United States. It's a value-added process, cracked there. The raw material comes back to us to transform in our 18 plants in Canada or our 7 plants in the United States. It is such an integrated supply chain that pulling that apart at this stage of the game, I think, would be catastrophically devastating for both Canada and the United States.
Well, and you mentioned energy, and I'm so glad you did, because that is an area of just on its face cooperation across North America, and it's been good for all 3 countries. And it's not, for the most part, it hasn't been included in NAFTA, but to the extent that, for political reasons, but to the extent now that economies have changed and politics have changed, this may be one data point, or one sector is a better way to put it, that could really drive us toward the end game that I think all the previous panel suggested they'd like to get to, and I certainly would as well. So thank you for that. You know, Audrae brought into her discussion the idea of the consumer, which is also oftentimes overlooked in the trade discussions, and thank you so much for doing that. The express delivery industry is really all about the consumer, isn't it, Amgad? I mean, you know, it's getting products to the people who order them. It's, you know, I'm not going to mention any individual companies to give any free advertisements, but the truth of the matter is the business model has changed. And, you know, this brings small and medium-sized businesses from a producer perspective into the discussion. But from the consumer perspective, I mean, you guys live and die on the ability of consumers to get products. To the extent that this was complicated, again, what would that mean for a company like UPS, but not from the perspective of the accounting and figures and numbers? What would it mean from the perspective of jobs?
You know, I would tell you that similar to the hula hoop story, we're the virtual pipes in the express delivery service of delivering those goods, right? So e-commerce, the advent of e-commerce never existed 23, 24 years ago. So I would punctuate, if I could, the previous panel where there's an update needed to NAFTA. And that update really is to recognize that whole new world of e-commerce, connectivity, and the movement of goods through those digital means.
And from that perspective, though, I mean, you know, we hear so much about trade balances and job creation and all that. Give a sense of what updating NAFTA or modernizing it in that way might mean.
I think paperwork. It takes as much to move a box this big as a container or a truckload. We really have to think about paperwork, efficiency, digitization, and how do you leverage technology that never existed before to move those goods across the border?
You know, the world has changed. You NAFTA is what, not quite 25 years old. Facebook just celebrated its 10th anniversary. I'm not suggesting that Facebook is the be-all and end-all, but I am suggesting that the world has fundamentally changed. But think about not just social media, think about the car that you might be driving today versus the car that you were driving in 1994. Actually, I'm still driving the same car from 1994. I'm in the nonprofit world, but no, that's a separate story. But the idea that cars and soon trucks are going to be driving themselves, I mean, this is fundamental change.
World's changed.
So, Audrae, agriculture has changed too. Technology has changed agriculture fundamentally. I mean, you know, I'm from Illinois. You still have to put a seed in the ground and it still has to sprout. So there's some realities there, but technology is fundamentally changing agriculture. If you had a magic wand and you could update, modernize NAFTA, let's put it differently. If you could update the North American relationship from an economic perspective, what would you like to see?
Well, I think it's important to look at the TPP because many food and agricultural organizations really strongly supported the TPP, certainly not all, but the vast majority. And there are provisions in the TPP that were excellent for agriculture, one of which is the SPS Plus. And that really takes a look at our commodities are perishable, our products have shelf lives, we need quick and rapid resolution to some of these protractable problems, and the SPS Plus provisions in the TPP really generate that result. You might think, though, that with what is the first agreement that comes along that the U.S. might negotiate, there could be an opportunity to create the blueprint for future agreements, whether or not some of those provisions apply to NAFTA in particular, because we have a very highly integrated market with NAFTA countries that we may not have, for example, with Asia today, for example. And we see a lot of movement of, emergence, I should say, of certain provisions, new non-tariff barriers to food and agricultural products, whereby it might be worthwhile to see what could be done with the TBT agreement to ensure that measures that are being proposed against our category by certain ministries that typically don't deal with trade, like ministries of health, are truly based on science. Maybe IPR provisions where brands and the packaging, where consumers recognize the high quality products that we make in North America, the safe products, by the way, that are unparalleled in the world, that are made here in North America can be easily identifiable by consumers. So there could be certain tweaks, if you will, to the IPR provisions that would help in the future more so than within NAFTA. So those are just some examples I would have.
And you raised Asia, you raised TPP. The previous panel, somebody, I think it might have been Warren, talked about China or brought China into the conversation. So Ves, I want to bring this into our panel as well. One of the contentions that I've had for some time is that North America is good for our three economies for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is that if we really want to compete effectively with emerging markets like China, like India, like other emerging markets globally, that the North American platform as a fully integrated space is fundamental to that ability to do so. Is that fair? Is that accurate? And how do you see the ability to compete globally, depending on what happens with NAFTA?
Well, fundamentally, our industry is very dependent on natural gas.
Right.
We have a world advantage with natural gas. Our natural gas prices are 1/4 that of China's, and that really is a wonderful strategic advantage. As we look to the rest of the world, that is a wonderful export opportunity for us. Gilles Gauthier from the Canadian Embassy spoke earlier on in the session talking about CETA. What fascinates me about the Canadian-European trade agreement that has just been ratified in Europe, and our Prime Minister, I think, was there yesterday, is that there's a reciprocity clause in that agreement, which talks about we will open our markets to you as long as those markets are equally open to us. I think that's a wonderfully elegant way to do business between countries. In spite of the fact that we have NAFTA, we have FTA, we have excellent trade relations with the United States, there are pockets where market access isn't as fair and open as it could be. I think there's still wonderful opportunity between all our countries to work together and make sure our markets are are open and competitive and as efficient as possible. And if that happens, I think no one can challenge us around the world. We'll be very efficient globally.
We're going to go to the audience here in just a minute, so have the ability to ask the questions that might be on your mind. We've got a good period of time, and we're doing this intentionally. Not quite yet, but we will be circulating the microphone very shortly. This is just your 3-minute warning, if you will. But Amgad, I want to come back to you've done, trade issues globally. And I just really want to drill down, no pun intended, Beth, but I really want to drill down on the topic of competitiveness within North America. I mean, you see it in a day-to-day. What is it that makes, forget about NAFTA, what is it that makes North America as an economic unit competitive? Or is that something, is that a concept of the past that we just don't have to think about anymore because the world has changed so fundamentally and there are other things, e-commerce has remade trade patterns and global, production, chains, et cetera, et cetera? Or is this something that we should fight to protect?
There's one big advantage we have, and it's staring us in the face: proximity. Global supply chains, the cost of movement of goods, the efficiency of movement of goods, the lag of movement of those goods, the just-in-time inventories. You have to stack all those up on one side of the page, and then you look at proximity. You look at the integrated nature and the platform of Canada and Mexico. Look at the energy strength. It takes a lot to tip the scales versus proximity. So we should leverage that, and we should use that to our.
And speaking of proximity, Audrae, of course, the agriculture sector is spread across the entire United States. I'm not going to ask you to expose any intra-industry issues, but is it uniformly supported within agriculture that North America is something that has been good? Or are there sectors that might want a renegotiation and have a different attitude? I mean, I'm asking you to speak for the agriculture sector, right? That's a big sector. Help us think through that a little bit.
Well, let me just say that around about what I think was January 23rd, 133 organizations, trade associations, companies, strong interests that represent a cross-section of America sent a letter to President Trump indicating how important the NAFTA agreement is to us. So that's an initial sign. All of us understand the need to modernize the NAFTA and truly support that. But writ large, the NAFTA market is extremely important to the sector. So I'll just start there. Another thing I would say that when you look across all of America, truly every geographic corner of the country considers NAFTA to be either its number one market, or number three. And maybe 1 and 3, or maybe 1 and 2, when you consider Mexico and Canada. But it's extremely important whether you're talking about dairy and rice in the South, whether you're talking about livestock and animal products and grains in the Midwest, or whether you're talking about the specialty crops, as we call them, fruits and vegetables, in the western part of the U.S. and in the northeast part of the U.S. So truly, it has been an agreement that's been unparalleled for the sector. Now, there will always be certain commodities, for sure, that would like to see certain things addressed, no doubt. And I think the one that's been the most prominent, there are groups, International Dairy Foods Association, U.S. Dairy Export, National Milk Producers Federation, that have specific views about Canada on dairy that they've made quite prominent. Those are their positions. I'm not advocating for those positions, but they have been quite prominent in their desire to see a further opening. So I would just leave it at that.
No, thank you, and that's very, very helpful. But broadly speaking, I mean, across sectors and across geographic areas within the U.S., which of course is many congressional districts, it does seem as if agriculture is mostly unified on these topics. And that's really what I wanted to tease out.
Very much so. Very much so. And these are rural economies, and many of them are in the red states and red districts, as you can imagine. So very important to the sector.
So Veso, to you, and then we will go to the audience for your questions. We just talked a little bit, we just touched on politics, and I'm not going to ask any of you to delve into the political side of things necessarily unless you want to. That'd make things interesting, but I'm not going to ask you to. But in the context of Canada, I mean, look, all three of these countries are strong democracies, all have domestic politics. Mexico has elections coming up in 2018 that Ken referenced, and what we see already is potentially some issues in Mexico that are being not driven, but being impacted by the United States. From the Canadian perspective, give us a sense at least of the public mood. I mean, are people saying what's going on? Are people saying, well, we kind of agree that NAFTA should be modernized too? Are they saying, let's scrap the whole thing, it's been a complete failure? Just what's the public mood in Canada on international trade and North American trade specifically?
I think in a very big way, Canada believes America's already great again because you won the gold medal in the junior hockey championship that just happened a couple of weeks ago. But we lost. We came in second there, of course. But the general mood is we view America as our best friends. What happens to America happens to Canada. We're absolutely vested in your success. If you don't do well, we don't do well. There was only a short time in my lifetime that I can remember that we were doing slightly better than you were, and that was during the 2008 recession, where many American manufacturers were coming up to Canada selling their goods, and we welcomed them with open arms. We had an infrastructure program. They were able to compete on that program. They were able to tender their goods. We had reciprocal trade, and when your economy was lagging, we were doing a little bit better. That helped you at that particular period in time. We want America to succeed. A strong America is great for Canada. And I just have to refer back to a couple of my personal examples. I remember in the year 2000, there's a little town just outside of Toronto called Walkerton, Ontario. They had bad water, E. coli in the water system. 7 died, 2,000 got sick. And we went in there and we helped replace all that pipe with our product, and that was something that we did when our governments were all gridlocked, couldn't do anything to fix the problem. You had a similar problem recently in Flint. You had lead in the water in Flint, and it's fascinating what's happened there. The solution to that problem: we're shipping lots and lots of pipe now to Flint. Our pipe doesn't have any lead, and the proximity that you mentioned before has really been good in that the product coming from Ontario has been helping the folks in Michigan with their lead water issues. So for us, the border is just a line on a map. We hope it remains that way. Coming down here yesterday, it took me all of 2 seconds to clear the border. We hope that that continues. We wish you the best of success in the next 4 or 8 years moving forward. You have an infrastructure program that even if it isn't the $1 billion that is being touted right now, it doesn't matter. I think it'll be beneficial. We have an infrastructure program. It'll be beneficial for both our companies and all those folks involved in that sector to compete, because competition really is the heart of efficiency. And when everybody sharpens their pencil, everybody wins.
Thank you. Well, on that note, let's go to the audience. We have circulating microphones. There's a question here with, yeah, here we go. And we'll take a round of 3. So we'll take this one first.
Mike Massetti, PBS Online NewsHour for Ms. Erickson. NAFTA, as Warren was saying in the previous panel, has the potential to split 2 elements of the Trump coalition, the blue-collar workers versus the ag areas, which voted record numbers for Trump. Have you all developed a lobbying strategy, and have you found the locus of power on trade issues within this administration yet?
Mike, thank you. He always goes right to the heart of the matter. Thank you, Mike. There was a question right here, I believe, on the aisle.
You mentioned that trade didn't play.
Yourself, please?
Excuse me?
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. Chris Serwinski, ACG Analytics. You mentioned that energy didn't play a huge part in NAFTA, obviously, in the first place. But considering now that Mexico has, enabled private investment and whatnot, despite the strengthening of the left Obrador over there right now, do you see energy playing a bigger part in any renegotiation? I've heard of, like, the North American Energy Union, for example, being floated.
Thank you. Excellent question. And I think there was a third. There we go. On the aisle on the far side.
Hi, Ian Ferguson with the Congressional Research Service. Mr. Sobot, you're in the pipe business. You sound like you had mentioned talking about tendering contracts. Sounds like you want to do something with Buy American in a renegotiated NAFTA, and I just was interested in finding out if that is in fact the case. What would you like to have, and whether you think it's realistic to do that in a Congress that jealously guards the Buy American principle?
All good questions. Well, Audrae, since you got the first question, why don't we start with you, to the extent you'd like to make comments on this question.
By the way, thank you for the softball question. No, let me just say that I would say that the very strong coalition of the food and agricultural sector sees this purely as an economics issue. And it's really establishing its arguments and its strategy in that context. Because that's, in the end, what really matters to the sector is to continue to grow our opportunities, to continue to increase our market access, to continue to deepen the economic integration in North America, since it's been so beneficial for our sector. And so while we're very, very, very focused on NAFTA and what happens there, clearly we're hoping for that third scenario that the earlier panel talked about, a balancing of all interests, because we certainly think that's possible. At the same time, we're also focused on Asia, because there's much to be gained from our ability to continue to open markets in that sector as well. And in the end, through doing so, focusing on North America, focusing on Asia, and by all of Asia, I also mean China, but also Southeast Asian markets that wanted to join the TPP, much can be gained economically that will continue to create jobs for our sectors. Our sector broadly, which represents over 15 million workers and is seen as the largest manufacturing sector in the United States, processing combined with agricultural production. But we are very willing to work with the Trump administration to realize the benefits that we think are out there.
And can I keep the thread with you, Audrae, on the energy side as well? Now, most people wouldn't necessarily think about agriculture and energy, but U.S. and Mexico in particular on biofuels is huge. And I'm not sure to the extent that you personally are involved in this, so it may be a misdirected question, but to the extent you have thoughts, then we'll go to Veso on the energy side, and then I'll come back to Amgad. But would you have any thoughts on that? Because when we talk about energy, people naturally think of oil and gas, which is obviously massive. We don't necessarily think of alternatives, although that's increasingly large in the North American context, wind, geothermal, et cetera, but biofuels for the agriculture sector is massive.
Absolutely, and so certainly another opportunity for increasing access globally, I might add. And that's whether it's Europe, whether it's Asia, whether it comes from corn, whether it comes from soybeans. Really, there's a lot of potential there. And other agricultural products, I might add. So everyone can get in the game. It's nothing quite like growing your own energy. And that's what agriculture has to offer.
Well, the reason why you're talking the way I rudely interrupted you, and I apologize for that, what you were saying was generating ideas in my head in terms of the power of energy to really help drive some of the NAFTA discussion. Because it is so multifaceted and it does affect literally everybody, every consumer. Everybody uses energy by definition. Veso, you've talked about your own use of energy as a feedstock for what you do. Can energy help drive, or let me ask it differently because I've just previewed that, but how might energy drive a rethink of North America, particularly since it really hasn't been part of NAFTA to this point?
Well, I was saying our principal feedstock is natural gas.
Right.
It really is shipped to our principal suppliers in Houston, in Dallas, in Louisiana, and in New Jersey. So when we hear Buy America, we say we do buy America because 99% of all our raw materials come from the United States. A little bit comes from Niagara Falls, Canada, every once in a while. So when we hear that the Buy American terminology, Canada, especially in our sector, does that every single day. Now, Buy America isn't new to us in that the previous administration in 2009 signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and it took about 8, 10, 12 months for Canada and the United States to negotiate a Canadian exemption to Buy America back then. I would hope that we don't have to do that again. I would hope that that would be a lot easier process. And the two words "Buy America" are easily placed in a bill, and the two words "Accept Canada" are easily placed in a bill too.
And I would say except Mexico too, for that matter. Well, speaking of that, I mean, look, Amgad, you brought into the conversation early on the idea that 40% of Mexican production is U.S. content, 25% is Canadian. By the way, the comparative number, according to the Bureau of Economic Statistics, is 4% from China. So it's 10 times the amount of U.S. content in Mexican versus Chinese production, which I think is compelling. But the question then becomes, what is Buy America? And from the perspective of UPS or the express delivery sector, or broadly speaking, the transportation sector, what does that even mean?
Built a fantastic platform. NAFTA works. It's a platform that, at our business, we're agnostic in regards to the vehicle. Our religion really, I think, is efficiency. And the proximity advantage, the platform that we build together that everybody talks about, is essential. It's the cornerstone of the platform that we have to enhance. I would say to you, scenario 3 for us, Wendy, just make it better and make it competitive. Make it a platform that allows regional integration to really help compete against them.
Well, we have time, I think, for maybe 2 additional questions. We're going to go here to Chip. The microphone, and I see Steve. Actually, is there any question in the back before the microphone comes all the way to the front? None? Okay, so we've got 2 up front. Was it? I didn't see. I'm sorry.
Gotta raise it higher. I don't know if they stopped.
Microphone here, all the way to the front, please.
Thanks. Just a quick comment. Most of the Buy America things, such as what is suggested, the Keystone Pipeline, would be just a flagrant violation of the NAFTA as it exists now, and the WTO and so forth. So it strikes me that when I was talking about this, I think people haven't done major, or there hasn't been a lot of public attention to trade in a long time, and one result is the press acts like this is just a normal thing to do. But you're talking about a trade war if you're talking about most of the Buy America. You can do some binational, but that's restricted to government procurement, and the parties that agree to go out amongst each other. But the question I was going to ask is really, particularly in the manufacturing sector, and services sectors and so forth, is there, it really has surprised me in a sense, and there doesn't seem to be, agriculture has been stirring, but the level of passivity as, trade proposals are kind of floated out that are just astonishing, and they don't seem to attract that much attention. Or they say, well, we employ lots of Americans too. Is that changing? Is this conference the beginning of the business community paying attention to these issues?
Thank you. Those are good questions. And then we're going to go to Steve over here. But as the microphone is making its way, the point you're making about simply violating existing trade agreements, I think, is absolutely right. And it ground truths some of this conversation that we're having at kind of a political level. I mean, there are some legalities here that presumably matter. So thank you for that. We'll get to the question in a second. Let's go to Steve.
Let me ask you more of a mercantilist question than a more generic one. If the agreement falls apart, not only do we lose preferential access, but given the number of free trade agreements that Mexico has with other countries, we're put at a preferential disadvantage, obviously, given the signatures. What would happen to our trade if instead of having a preferential position, we were actually in a discriminatory position to a lot of agricultural production? My real question, why isn't this emphasized enough? I don't hear much people talking about preferences. They talk about general theories. And then my last point is, the best question, which wasn't answered, so I want to just remind you, was, where is the current center of trade policy in the U.S. I don't know the answer, so I'd love to hear somebody else's views. Anyway, thank you so
Actually,
much,
we're
Eric.
going to take a poll on that question. As you're leaving, please fill out the poll, and we'll post the results. No, I'm just being facetious here. Amgad, why don't we start with you? You know, you're obviously a representative of the services sector. Is this something that the sector, broadly speaking, is taking seriously and engaging on? And if so, how so?
So the earlier panel talked about it being in the first quarter of the game. It's early on, Chip, to answer your question. We are engaged. The private sector is engaged. Peterson Institute, Wilson, Brookings, multiple associations. There's a lot of work, but there's a lot of what ifs. So we're in this scenario place where we don't have particulars. I've never worked so hard to achieve nothing, right? Where we're running all these scenarios because we're not quite sure what avenue we're going to go down. And again, the best scenario is make it better, make it more efficient, make it more competitive. Full stop.
Audrae, to you for either of the two questions that you would.
Same, I would agree that it's a matter of all of us coming together, and I think that was stressed on the last panel, that when we all come together, and I mean interests in Canada, interests in the US, interests in Mexico, together we can create an even better agreement. Together we can have a win-win-win. Together we can increase the export platforms to the other part of the world. And importantly, together we can do what's already happening in agriculture with our counterparts in NAFTA, the governments as well as the private sector, is that we're working together on policy integration. So together we can negotiate as a bloc to achieve the outcomes that we very much desire when it comes to other markets like, I'll just say, Asia.
And Beth, we're going to give you the last word from the perspective of answering the questions and any final thoughts you might have as well.
Please don't ask me to answer any questions about American politics because that's a real tough one for me. But from a NAFTA point of view and from a Canada-U.S. relationship point of view, I hope and I think this has been achieved to some degree this week, the principle of do no harm. Start from do no harm and let's build on what we have right now that's working very well. I think will go a long way for us. And the ambassador of Mexico said it very well in the first panel. I encourage all business folks to get engaged. This is real. This will affect a generation's future, and we need to pay attention right now, and we need to engage with the opinion leaders out there all over Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And we need to talk to our elected representatives, because I think if we do a good job of this, I think we will see a great 4, maybe a great 8, maybe a great 12, maybe a great 16 years. NAFTA has really given us a great almost quarter century.
And from my perspective, you know, I get asked this all the time in terms of media or whatever, you know, particularly with reference to Mexico, but also a little bit with Canada. You know, what's the view in Canada and Mexico, et cetera? And while I cannot speak for the Canadians or Mexicans, it does seem to me that the reaction of the people and governments of both those countries has been remarkably restrained to U.S. politics. I mean, you know, doing scenarios, predicting the future, trying to game out what might happen. But, you know, the visits, the seriousness of the conversation, the recognition that the United States is in a certain political moment, to me, I think that's actually been encouraging, because it shows that people aren't trying to use this to go absolutely bananas and blow everything up. Nonetheless, the reality is that that may be one of the scenarios that has to be anticipated and therefore, you know, evaluated and hopefully worked toward a different outcome. But it does seem to me, again, that all of us working together can come toward the third scenario that was produced by the first panel. And I would say that if we don't work together, we probably won't get to that place. So that's my final comment. I would simply thank our panelists for your terrific contributions. I would thank the Asia Society Policy Institute one more time, and Wendy Cutler for her and their engagement today to put on this program, which I think has been fascinating. Both panels, I've learned a lot. I hope you have as well. And one final item of business, I would ask all of you to join me in please thanking the panelists for their comments here today.